First of all, a big thank you to the National Farm Animal Care Council for sponsoring this session. Our collective thanks to Chris, Matthew, and Christy at FMC, and to Wayne here at UBC, who have done technical wonders on this presentation that I didn't think were possible. And my personal thanks to all of you for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you today. I truly feel honored that you are participating in this discussion. The title, the question that I want to ask in today's session is, could animal production become a profession? Well, of course, animal production is already a business, a way of life, at the very least, a job. But the question I want to ask is, could it be transformed to be more like a profession that people will trust and less like an industry that people want to regulate? And to do this, I want to review the concerns that people have over industrialization, then ask how this applies to intensification of animal production, and then finally how the professions provide a different way of working. But since that sounds like a rather cerebral theme, I have added a one-slide animal welfare identification quiz. Here on the screen, all nicely painted up, are different examples of an environmental enrichment device that was widely used about a century ago to improve the welfare of a particular species of animal, especially in Western North America. Underneath is a pan of some sort, and above is a rotating part. And these were so widely used that about 20 different patents were issued for this device in the early 1900s. If it isn't immediately obvious to you what these are for, then perhaps you can, when the talk gets a little too technical and tedious, turn your mind to working out what these are. And please add, if you identify them, put your answer in the Q&A box, because I have a very small and obscure prize for the first correct answer. All right, well, this is a strange way to start a talk about animal welfare, but I wanted to begin with how our society responded to industrialization at the time of the Industrial Revolution, because I think it helps to explain a lot of what we're seeing today. Of course, as you know, in the 17 and 1800s, factories became the major way of producing textiles and other goods throughout much of Europe. And traditional workers operating hand looms in their homes, in villages, and the countryside could no longer compete with these new, cheaper manufactured goods. And many people were forced by economic necessity to move into cities that were then crowded and often unhealthy, and work in factories that were often oppressive and dangerous. It was a profound change in society that triggered profound expressions of regret over this development. And it set up a skepticism of industry that I think is still with us today. Of course, one of the oldest ideas in our culture is that agrarianism, meaning rural living, where people produce food in a way that is in harmony with nature and the land, that agrarianism is the best kind of life for people. Aristotle wrote, "The best common people are the agricultural population, so that it is possible to introduce democracy as well as other forms of constitution where the multitude lives by agriculture or by pasturing cattle." And that idea has echoed down the centuries. Around 1950, we encounter American writer Lewis Bromfield writing, "The good farmer is one of the ultimate peaks of evolution. He is the one citizen without whom mankind and civilization cannot exist." And as recently as this century, here's the American poet Wendell Berry calling for a return to agrarian life in the hope that we might become a healthy people in a healthy land. So here was, shall we say, a philosophical concern about industrialization, because industrialization was seen as replacing that wholesome agrarian life of the countryside. But there was also a practical concern focused on the welfare of the factory workers, many of whom were children and women, some of the children magically captured in this ancient photograph of a factory. People forced by economic necessity to work what we today would consider appallingly long hours, in some cases in terrible industrial conditions. As just one example of the concern, in 1833, when the British Parliament was considering regulating these environments, one witness testified to Parliament about the children. Drowsy and exhausted, the poor creatures fall too often among the machinery, which is not in many instances sufficiently sheathed, when their muscles are lacerated, their bones broken, or their limbs torn off. Now, in England, the policy response to this was a series of laws called the Factory Acts, which were designed to limit the hours of work and improve the safety and health of the working environment. And just a few examples from England. In 1802, there was an act requiring ventilation and cleaning of textile factories. 1819 set a maximum 12-hour working day for children aged 9 to 16. 1844, machinery had to be fenced. 1878, no children under 10 could work in factories. And in 1901, there was a requirement to protect people from dust and fumes, and also to provide 7 cubic meters of airspace per person as a way of trying to ensure some level of air quality. So even if society couldn't turn the clock back to its earlier agrarian past, at least the welfare of workers could be protected by regulating the factory environment and the time that people were exposed to it. All right, I started with that long piece of history because I think it sets the stage for what we have seen in the industrialized countries in the response to intensive animal production. And first, just for clarity, let's use the term intensification to mean 3 related things. First, the consolidation of ownership so that animals are raised on fewer, larger farms. Second, some degree of confinement of animals in buildings and feedlots. And third, some level of automation and cost cutting. And by those criteria, the industrialized countries have undergone major intensification, mostly in systems using concentrated and grain-based diets, so that's systems for pigs, poultry, eggs, in some cases dairy, but not for the grazing systems of sheep and beef production. Now, to the people who practice it, intensification basically means modernization of their activities, whereby production efficiency is increased through the use of specialization, automation, economies of scale, and now increasingly electronic technology. And people who see intensification as modernization tend to support it. And some international development agencies actively promote intensification of livestock production in the poor countries as a way of reducing rural poverty and improving food security. But to much of the public in the industrialized countries, intensive animal production is not so much modernization as industrialization. Farming is said to have become factory farming. Animals are being turned into, quote, animal machines. These are not phrases I like, but they capture this widespread perception of intensification as an industrialization process. And that perception triggered a response that I think has been a remarkable replay of what we saw earlier during the Industrial Revolution. Again, there was a philosophical concern about the decline of agrarian life and the farm family. Critics claimed, for example, replacing family farms are enormous factory farms owned by huge conglomerates. And in the past half century, animal agriculture in the US has been taken over by corporations, turning family farms into factory farms. These are quotes from the US, even implying to the naive reader that it is the corporate ownership that has caused the confinement housing systems. And this concern over the loss of agrarian life and the family farm has played such a large role in the debate that we saw, for example, in California in the famous Proposition 2 debate that eventually led to a banning of certain intensive production methods. We saw both sides in their material to try to persuade voters. Both sides were claiming to be defending the family farm. That's how powerful the message about agrarianism and family farming has been. Right, so that was the philosophical concern. But there was also a practical concern over how the new environments were affecting those inside them. But in this case, the focus fell on the animals rather than the workers. And the response followed the old Factory Act so closely that one British observer actually called the early standards a kind of, whoops, I need to restore my ability to, thank you. It called the early standards a Factories Act for animals. And like the Factories Acts, a lot of the emphasis was on regulating the physical environment. For example, and I need to advance here, Wayne. In 1988, a law required that hens in the UK would have 450 square centimeters of floor space, rising in 2003 to 550 square centimeters, rising in 2012 to 750 square centimeters with a perch nest box and litter. So the point I was making was that when we look at basic welfare outcomes in on different farms, all using the same kind of physical environment, we find something very interesting. Taking broiler chickens as an example, one of the key variables that's often regulated is space allowance, and a large British study compared basic welfare outcomes, death rate, very basic, incidence of lameness, leg lesions, foot lesions, and a few other variables on 114 flocks kept by 10 different companies. And each company agreed to keep some of the flocks at each of 5 different stocking densities reflecting the wide range of commercial practice. The results showed that the stocking density did make some difference to some of the variables, but the really huge differences were not between different levels of space allowance, but between different companies. For example, the death rate in the best company was achieving a mortality rate before the birds were shipped to slaughter of 1.4%. The worst company had a mortality rate of an astonishing 14%. Similarly, lameness ranged from no birds visibly lame in the best company to 90% of birds lame in the worst. Leg lesions 0 to 80%, foot lesions 0 to 88%. All of these in the same type of physical environment, that is, open litter floor barns. This kind of variation turns out to be more the rule than the exception. For example, next slide, study of 206 flocks looking at moderate and severe foot lesions ranging from 0% in the best flock to 72% in the worst, and another study of 176 flocks, lameness ranging from 0 to 84% of birds. Okay, let's take switch species. In the case of piglets, piglet mortality statistics are often collected as important production statistics. I think these must be regarded also as animal welfare figures because most of these young animals are dying from some combination of starvation, chilling, and traumatic injury. In Norway, requirements now are that farrowing sows are kept in loose housing. Here was a study of 39 Norwegian farms, all using this methodology, and piglet deaths ranged from 5% mortality in the best farm to 24% in the worst. Study in Canada, 30 farms, piglet deaths, mostly in farrowing crates. The range was 10% in the best farm to 32% in the worst. And 83 organic farms in Europe recently studied. The mortality rate ranged from 0, must have been a small unit, to an astonishing 50%. One more example, most dairy cattle in Western Canada and the US are kept in some kind of freestall. Some of my colleagues did a study of 121 freestall dairy farms, collecting such basic variables as lameness, and found that lameness was 5% of cows lame in the best farm, 85% of cows lame in the worst. And again, this is the rule rather than the exception. 50 farms in Minnesota, lame and severely lame from 3 to 57%, and then 205 farms in the UK, 0 to 79%. Okay, a blank screen, because my goal here is to flood you with numbers to show that for different measures and different species, all of these lead us to a conclusion so simple that it can be expressed in a tweet. In fact, the best science can often be expressed in a tweet. The world is round. The planets orbit the sun. These are groundbreaking scientific tweets. So here's my tweet to summarize all those and many other sets of data. Very different welfare outcomes occur in the same type of physical environment. So why is this? Well, I think the answer is surely that animal welfare outcomes depend only partly on features of the physical environment, but depend enormously on the skill, knowledge, and attentiveness of the animal producer and staff. In the case of dairy cattle, for example, the risk of lameness and leg injuries is affected by good maintenance of the bedding, because cows will lie down more if there's plenty of dry, clean bedding. It's affected by hygiene, because walking in mucky aisles can spread pathogens that cause disease in the hooves. It's affected by nutrition, because the wrong diets can lead to metabolic disturbances that affect the structure and function of the hoof. And of course, it's affected by animal handling, because inappropriate herding can lead to fast movements that cause hoof injuries. In the case of piglets, the risk of dying, piglets dying soon after birth can be reduced by providing warm, draft-free environments, timely fostering in large litters, assisting weak piglets, assisting sows in long parturition, and of course hygiene, because a lot of deaths happen are concentrated in litters where mastitis has caused a reduction in the milk supply. So here we see a difference between intensification and industrialization. When factory workers spend only part of their day in factories, then regulating the time they spend there and the conditions in the factory are a reasonable way to assure that the welfare concerns about the factory environment are addressed. But when animals spend their entire lives under human control, good animal welfare depends less on the specific features of the physical environment, important as these are in some cases, and more on the skill, knowledge, and attentiveness of the people. So if we want to improve animal welfare, along with food safety, environmental protection, and other goals, what we really need to do is foster the skill, knowledge, and attentiveness of the people involved. Well, this brings me to the topic of professional animal production, because animal production doesn't have to be either it's agrarian or it's industrial. As another option, we can look to the professions, a kind of work that developed particularly during the last century and found its most sophisticated form in healthcare. In the 1840s, when Florence Nightingale announced that she wanted to become a nurse, by all reports, her family and friends were horrified. Being a nurse wasn't quite as bad as being an actress or a prostitute, but it was certainly something that no respectable young woman at that time would do. Of course, Nightingale went on to found the first school of nursing, and around 1900, roughly 50 years after Florence Nightingale went to improve nursing conditions in the earlier Crimean War, progressive countries were starting to recognize the registered nurse as a recognized profession. I think doctors and surgeons have undergone an even more amazing transformation. A century ago, owning 100 beef cattle would generate a greater income than being a mere doctor or surgeon, and probably reflected a higher status in society. But then the doctors and surgeons formed themselves into professions, and in that way generated a high level of public trust and some obvious economic benefits. So what's a profession? Well, they aren't all the same, but by most accounts, professions include three elements. First, the main outcome is service, usually to public, to the clients or to the public. Participation requires competence, typically demonstrated to peers, and ethical acceptability comes from adhering to the ethical expectations of society, usually through some form of self-regulation. And we might contrast this with a sort of stereotypical industrial model where the main outcome is products for sale, whether or not these genuinely provide a service, where participation requires market success rather than competence demonstrated to peers, and ethical acceptability comes from obeying regulations because we generally regulate industries where we allow professions to regulate themselves. Now, the distinction isn't always watertight, but it's usually fairly clear. For example, industries may use advertising to get people to buy their products. So they may advertise to get you to buy another car or a newer car or their kind of car rather than some other car that would work just as well. In contrast, we don't see heart surgeons advertising to make you want more heart surgery or to get your heart surgery from them rather than from some competing surgeon who could also do the job. Okay, given these three criteria, could animal producers reshape their work so that it is more like a profession that is trusted and less like an industry that people want to regulate? Well, first of all, are animal producers providing a service or just trying to sell products? 50 years ago, with the Green Revolution, we saw a huge increase in grain production. And this led to a huge increase in the production of grain-based systems of livestock production, poultry, pigs, eggs especially. And at that time, we saw the pork sector, for example, competing with the poultry sector for market share, and it looked quite a bit like Ford and GM. I think we are now entering a time when the demand for food is expected to increase beyond current supplies, partly because of world population growth, climate change, and other factors. And just this change, independent of what producers and their organizations do, I think just this change is gradually going to make food production look less like an industry and more like providing an important service. Second is competence. Doctors can't just decide that they are going to be doctors, they have to demonstrate their ability. Well, could this possibly be applied to animal production? Well, again, 50 years ago, it would have been inconceivable. At that time, the usual wisdom was that anyone could farm, and millions did so. In fact, in the 1941 census, it showed almost 500,000 farms had pigs in Canada. Today, that number is probably somewhat under 7,000. That is, we have about 1/10 as many pig farmers in Canada as we have doctors. So animal production has become a very specialized occupation with specialized knowledge, and some of the practitioners are achieving very high levels of performance, as we saw in the really good statistics coming from those surveys in that I just reviewed. Now, many producers would think it was outrageous to say that they need to demonstrate their competence. But in fact, we are actually seeing a growing trend for certification, accreditation of farms for things like food safety, animal welfare, environmental protection, and so on. Now, some of these schemes come from organizations like organics or from particular retailers, and they're intended to create confidence in specific product lines. But National Farm Animal Care Council has now produced a framework for producer organizations to develop animal care assessment programs whereby producers themselves will develop and manage systems that will ensure compliance with recognized standards. And I think as these become developed and implemented, they will move animal production much closer to a professional model. And third, could animal producers develop a self-regulatory system to show that they're adhering to the ethical expectations of society? And I think this step also is already in its early stages. Of course, a key development here is the codes of practice from the National Farm Animal Care Council. And the important point here is that these are not simply industry standards developed by producers themselves, but rather come from a formal code development process that involves 3 steps. First, a scientific review so that the science has a major input into the content. Second, an inclusive process so that the humane movement, regulators, veterinarians, and others are also included. And third, a period for public comment. And these 3 elements should give the codes a legitimacy that simple industry standards wouldn't have. And I think if producers are sufficiently open and courageous in accepting these inputs, then compliance with the codes should reflect adhering to the ethical expectations of society. I also see another move in this direction. In a typical industry model, public concerns over things like animal welfare, food safety, and the environment are dealt with by enforcement agencies, enforcing the law, charging people who are offenders, and so on. We are now seeing some agreements, sometimes formal, sometimes informal, between producer organizations and SPCAs, other regulators, so that producers play a key role in the enforcement process. So now imagine taking that one step further, so that concerns about animal welfare routinely come to the producer organization and they call in enforcement when they really need to. This would bring us much closer to the model of, for example, the medical profession, which polices itself, deals with most of its infractions itself, and calls in the law only when it's really necessary. So in all 3 of these respects, service, competence, and adherence to ethical expectations, I think animal production is not yet functioning like a profession, but we are already seeing changes occurring that make a professional model look much more feasible than ever before. What would this achieve? Well, first, I think it is by far the most promising way to safeguard animal welfare. Second, I think in time it would generate the kind of high level of trust in animal producers that we see in some of the other professions. And third, of course, it would give producers a leading role in driving the whole process. All right, a few conclusions. First, in the industrialized countries, the intensification of animal production has been widely perceived as an instance of industrialization, and this has triggered some of the same concerns that people had during the Industrial Revolution, specifically over the loss of agrarian life and the concern over those involved, although in this case, the focus has tended to be on the welfare of the animals rather than occupational safety and health of producers and workers. With that perception, animal welfare reforms have been modeled on worker welfare legislation that regulated the physical environment and exposure time in factories. But in animal production, the same kind of physical environment can produce very different animal welfare outcomes because animal welfare is greatly affected by the skill, knowledge, and attentiveness of producers and staff. Finally, I think shifting animal production toward a professional model is a more promising approach to improving animal welfare and maintaining public trust in animal producers. For those who are bears for punishment and want more details, the first part of the talk is actually captured in a book of mine called Understanding Animal Welfare. The second part is in an article called Could Animal Production Become a Profession?, which I am happy to send you if you drop me an email. And finally, these devices. I hope we've got some correct responses on record there. These are hog oilers. They were used for ectoparasite control of free-range pigs about a century ago. The lower part, the pan, would contain oil, and pigs would scratch against the upper part, cause it to rotate, and apply a certain amount of oil to their skin. I have no idea if they worked, but I'm sure those patents have now long expired in case someone sees here a business opportunity. Thank you very much.
And thank you, David, for that. We unfortunately did not receive a correct response. One fellow did respond. They were badly baked biscuits. That is obviously not correct. The closest we got was Tom, who said liquid feeder for pigs. So he had the right animal. So maybe we want to default and give it to old Tom there. He got the pigs correct. That's entirely up to you.
Sounds good.
I just want to say, well, first of all, some shocking stats on the mortality and such. And this was a topic particularly interesting to me. Is we have a conference at the end of the month in Regina called the Ag Excellence Conference, and our debate this year is about social license in farming. And animal welfare certainly plays a role in social license to farm and sort of the trust that the public and the consumers have in the farmer. So I'm going to move it on over to some questions. We only have a few up so far, so people, there's 180 of you. There must be a few more questions than 2 or 3, so please keep them rolling in. David, can you hear me at the moment?
Yes, I can. And I just wanted to say I would like a mailing address for Tom.
Sure, Tom. If you want to put that into the Q&A box, we can pass it on for you. And I'm just going to answer one question. It's a logistical one. Christy has asked, is this presentation available afterwards? Yes. All of the agri-webinars can be found on agriwebinar.com. So if you just put in agriwebinar.com into your browser, you'll see all the archived webinars from the last little while. And we do have a pretty intense series. So please, I'll go over some dates afterwards. Christy has also asked, David, what is the opinion of marketing based on care standards? Will this negate the benefit these standards may give to developing professionalism as it is a push for market share?
Oh, I'm not sure I quite grasped that. Could you repeat it again for me, Chris?
I guess there's 2 questions, really, David. The first is, what is the opinion of marketing based on care standards? And then the second is, will this negate the benefit these standards may give to developing professionalism as it is a push for market share?
Okay, thank you, Christy. I hope I will answer your question. I see. If we think of a company like Loblaw, Canada's largest food retailer, which is now coming out with some strong policy statements about wanting to ensure their customers about the welfare of the animals that go into their products. Loblaw is an associate member of National Farm Animal Care Council. They are I believe it's fair to say they see themselves as players in the process rather than an outside force that is disrupting the process. So if a company like that says to their customers, by such and such a date, we expect to be selling only products that are part of the National Farm Animal Care Council process of animal care assessment, I think it will be a huge step in favor of professionalization rather than something that detracts from it. Now, I'm not sure that I've grasped the question correctly, But no, I see the role of the marketing companies as being part of the solution rather than part of the problem.
Excellent. And again, that sort of echoes what we talk about with social licensure as well. Um, Scott has asked, what type of oversight do you see as necessary for verifying the implementation of these programs, such as third-party verification, self-monitored by industry groups, etc.?
Thank you, Scott. I don't think there is a one size fits all here, because, for example, we have fewer than 7,000 pig farms, but something like 60,000 cow calf ranches in Canada. So just numerically, uh, verification is going to look quite different depending on the sector. I would say I would suggest that each producer organization, reflecting the nature of that sector, develop a program that conforms to the basic requirements of the National Farm Animal Care Council's animal care assessment programs, and that will almost certainly mean a degree of self-evaluation in order to identify problems, some level of third-party evaluation, probably on a very periodic basis, on a sampling basis, to make sure that whatever system is in place is working. And then as the real meat and potatoes, an intermediate step where it doesn't have to be as formal as third party, but should be some kind of a program initiated and run by the producers themselves.
Thanks,
But
David.
just to finish, that mixture of first, second, and third party is going to vary considerably depending on the sector, the power of the sector, the number of producers involved, and so on.
Sorry, pardon the interruption. You answered Christy's question before. She has said thank you.
Okay, good, Christy.
On to Leonie. Leonie says, thank you very much, David, for this interesting talk. Animal welfare assessment is almost always focused on the absence or presence of negative welfare. How would you assess positive animal welfare?
Yeah, okay. Um, you're right, Leonie. Really, when we look at things like lameness, leg lesions, and so on, we are looking at negatives. I guess I would have to say, given the kind of statistics that have been found in the different surveys, that really has to be the first priority. Getting those figures of lameness, injury, high mortality rate, and so on, getting those down is surely step one. I see beyond that, maybe an example would be the opportunity to perform important types of natural behavior as an indicator of positive welfare. So, for example, research by Ian Duncan suggests that when hens dust bathe, this is not like hunger, where the desire to dust bathe increases and increases and becomes overwhelming. Rather, it's something they enjoy doing. If we think of the natural behavior of animals as consisting of two kinds of things, one, something like shivering, which is a response to a negative event, and the other is playing, exploring, other types of natural behavior that aren't in response to some immediate threat. Many of these are enjoyable to perform. So if we get to that point, giving the animals the opportunity to perform natural types of behavior that aren't just like shivering in response to negative events, but are actually ways of engaging with the environment, giving the animal some control, some choice over how it lives. I think that's the step for positive welfare, but I do think that solving some of the negative welfare problems is the first priority.
Thank you, David. On to Robert's question. Could you give other examples of welfare practices used in food producing animals other than spacing and ventilation?
Okay, the spacing and ventilation are examples of what we would call input standards. How much space do you provide? What air quality do you provide? I think the smart money now is on outcome-based standards, such as hitting targets for low levels of these health and welfare problems. So, for example, an assessment could be lameness shouldn't exceed such and such a percent. Broken wings on the line shouldn't exceed such and such a percentage of birds. So I think that is an important direction that people are maybe starting to go, but I think that needs to be really emphasized. Now, in some cases, the input standards remain extremely valid. For example, if we know that a certain level of ammonia in the air causes lung damage, it's far easier to test the ammonia level than to PM birds and look for lung damage. So where there's a good link between an input standard like air quality and space and an outcome, then by all means let's continue to use that. But let's also start shifting toward more outcome-based measures.
So on to Edward. He asks, self-regulated health professions are given authority by their province in Canada. Peer regulation of the profession must protect the public as opposed to protecting the profession. Is this something that fits with your model?
Yeah, thank you very much. That is a key question for sure. Uh, I think there is no real likelihood of provinces passing acts to in the short term that are going to allow animal producer organizations to self-regulate in a way that is legally recognized. So this is where I think involving the retail sector and other parts of the food chain is so important, because if so, start again here. There's a great temptation to retailers to use simple sound bites as a way of ensuring compliance with animal welfare standards. So something like free range. Well, that may sell, but it isn't an animal welfare standard. If instead the retail sector can be part of the solution, so that they're the ones who say, we are going to buy our products from people who conform to the accepted standards. I think that's the mechanism rather than provincial governments passing acts to allow self-regulation. I think we can achieve much the same in a business to business rather than a legal manner. That's my best answer to date. I'm optimistic that that is possible.
Perhaps expanding, I hope not in a form of redundancy to that question, Jacqueline asks, and this is me hoping it's not redundant. Jacqueline asks, what responsibility, if any, do retail and restaurant companies have to support animal agriculture as a profession, particularly given the pressures they are facing to source products from alternative systems?
Yeah, thank you. Good. It is a somewhat similar question, but let me give try to give a complementary answer. Um, to people on the outside, customers, to some extent retailers, Animal welfare seems to be about defined production systems rather than defined standards. So, cage-free, free run, free range, pasture fed, these sort of things. So these are defining production systems rather than actually setting standards. And I think it's a great temptation to retailers to use these buzzwords, and that the smart money, if it can be done, and I see some encouraging steps now. I think if the retail sector can be included in the process, so that instead of simply sourcing things according to defined production standards, they source things according to meeting accreditation programs. I think that's the way the solution can be achieved.
Thanks, David. Well, we're coming up on 2 o'clock. I'm going to ask you if you'd like to make any summarizing points, and then I'm going to steal the camera away from you and plug the next few ag webinars and say thank you and so on. So, do you have anything you'd like to sum everything up with, David?
No, just, my thanks to, I was overwhelmed at the number of people who signed up for this webinar. I feel very honored that you've been able to share some time with me today, and I look forward to maintaining the discussion in the future. Thank you very much.